There are truths that lie hidden, not because they are buried too deeply to be found, but because they are so near, so familiar, that we fail to see them. Among the ancient commandments, there is one that Christians have too easily dismissed, as though it belonged to another time, another covenant, another people, yet it was written by the same hand that carved "Thou shalt not kill," and "Thou shalt not steal." It is the command to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. It is not a suggestion, not a poetic flourish in the law, but a command rooted in creation itself. To ignore it is to ignore something vital about the nature of God, of humanity, and of the rest we so desperately seek yet rarely find. The Sabbath is not merely about ceasing from work, as though God simply wished to give us a day off. It is a window into the rhythm of heaven. The very first chapter of the Scriptures ends not with a command for humanity to create, but with a picture of God Himself resting. This is no ordinary rest. God did not rest because He was weary, for the eternal cannot grow tired. He rested because His work was complete, perfect, and worthy of delight. The Sabbath, then, is about entering into that divine delight, stepping back to behold what has been made and to declare, as God did, that it is good. When we forget this rhythm, we reduce life to a ceaseless treadmill of doing, making, and striving, never pausing to simply be. Our souls grow restless, for they were created to live in harmony with their Creator's design. In our modern world, the Sabbath seems strange, even impossible. We boast of our busyness as though it were a badge of honor. We speak of hustle, productivity, and ambition while secretly groaning under the weight of our own relentless striving. Even our religious activities are often frantic, filled with noise and motion rather than quiet trust. By neglecting the Sabbath, we have not merely broken a rule, we have lost a gift. It was made not as a burden, but as a blessing. The command to rest is a command to trust, for to cease from labor is to acknowledge that the world does not spin because of our effort, nor does our salvation depend on our performance. It is a weekly reminder that God is God, and we are not. When Christians neglect the Sabbath, we neglect the very heartbeat of our faith. We remember the cross, but we forget the garden tomb where Christ rested in death on the Sabbath, completing His work of redemption before rising on the first day of the week. We preach grace, but we live as though grace were just another form of labor, another to-do list. The Sabbath calls us back to a deeper truth. It whispers that we were not created merely to produce or consume, to achieve or acquire, but to dwell with God, to find our identity not in what we do, but in who He is. Some might say the Sabbath is no longer binding because it belongs to the old covenant. But if that were true, why would it be rooted not merely in Israel's history, but in the very creation of the world? Long before there was a chosen nation, there was a seventh day, holy and set apart. The Sabbath is older than sin, older than the law of Moses, older even than the need for salvation. It is woven into the fabric of the cosmos. To disregard it is to live out of step with the music of creation, like a dancer who insists on moving to a different rhythm than the one being played. Recovering the Sabbath is not easy. It feels like rebellion against the demands of our age, for the world will not stop when we stop. Emails will pile up, deadlines will loom, opportunities will seem to slip away. It requires faith to step off the treadmill, to trust that God will provide, to believe that His rest is better than our striving. It is, in a sense, doing the impossible, yet that is precisely why it is so transformative. By setting aside one day in 7 to cease from our labors, to worship, to delight in God and His creation, we bear witness to a different kingdom, a different king. We proclaim to the watching world that there is more to life than endless work, more to our worth than our productivity. The Sabbath is not about legalism or mere rule-keeping. It is about liberation. When God gave this command to Israel, it was in the context of deliverance from Egypt. The people who had once been slaves were now free, and the Sabbath was the weekly sign of that freedom. No longer would they live under the whip of Pharaoh, working without rest or mercy. Each Sabbath was a defiant act of resistance against every form of slavery, ancient or modern. Today, though our chains may be less visible, we are still enslaved to schedules, to screens, to systems that demand more and more of us. The Sabbath breaks those chains. It reminds us that we serve a Lord who bids us to lay down our burdens and find rest for our souls. To uncover the Sabbath secret is to rediscover a forgotten dimension of Christianity itself. It is to step into a rhythm of grace that sustains rather than exhausts, to live as though God truly reigns and His work is truly finished. It is not easy, for it calls us to swim against the current of our culture and even against our own restless hearts. But perhaps that is why it has been so easily forgotten, and why it must now be remembered anew. For in remembering the Sabbath, we remember who we are, who God is, and what it means to live not by the sweat of our brow, but by the gift of His grace. The Sabbath is a divine rhythm rooted in creation, not merely a law for ancient Israel. The Sabbath is not simply an ancient regulation or a ceremonial tradition for a specific group of people. It is a divine rhythm woven into the very fabric of creation itself. From the very first pages of Scripture, before there was sin, before there was a covenant people, before there was even a need for redemption, the pattern of 6 days of work, followed by 1 day of holy rest, was established by God Himself. This was not merely a command given to humanity later in history, but a reflection of God's own nature and design. When God created the heavens and the earth, He spoke everything into existence through 6 days of glorious, ordered creativity. Then, on the 7th day, He did something utterly profound. He rested, not because He was tired or lacking in strength, for the Almighty never grows weary, but because the work was perfect, complete, and worthy of being set apart. This act of resting was not passive idleness. It was an intentional act of delight, of sanctifying time itself, declaring that creation was not merely about function and utility, but about beauty, meaning, and holiness. By resting, God stamped a rhythm into the universe that reflects His own character and invites humanity to live in harmony with Him. This divine rhythm was later codified in the 10 Commandments, not as a new idea, but as a reminder of what was always true. When the commandment says, "Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy," it begins with the word remember because it points back to creation. Long before there were Israelites wandering through the desert, the Sabbath was already holy, already set apart. To keep the Sabbath, therefore, is not merely to obey a rule, but to align oneself with the very order of the cosmos. It is to live in step with the heartbeat of God's creation. Ignoring this pattern is like trying to swim against a powerful current or dance to a song while refusing to follow its rhythm. Eventually, the result is exhaustion, disharmony, and a loss of meaning. Humanity was not designed to live in a perpetual cycle of endless labor, anxiety, and striving. Just as the body needs sleep, the soul needs Sabbath, a weekly sanctuary of time where we step away from the demands of survival and production to enter into the delight and rest of our Creator. In a world that glorifies constant activity and productivity, the Sabbath stands as a radical, even countercultural, act of faith. It reminds us that time itself is holy and that there is more to existence than what we produce or consume. It whispers to us that life is not ultimately about what we achieve, but about who we are in relation to the One who made us. This is why the Sabbath was not limited to a particular group of people or a specific moment in history. It is not merely a Jewish custom or a relic of the Old Testament. Instead, it is a universal principle, as fundamental as gravity or the need for breath. Even those who do not consciously keep the Sabbath feel the effects of violating this rhythm. The rise of burnout, stress, and restlessness in our modern age is a symptom of living out of sync with God's design. By setting aside a day of rest, worship, and reflection, we are not imposing an artificial restriction on ourselves, but returning to the natural order of things. The Sabbath is a gift, not a burden. It was given to humanity so that we might taste even now the eternal rest that awaits us, a weekly glimpse of heaven where we cease from our labors and simply dwell in the presence of the Creator, who declared from the very beginning that all he had made was good. Neglecting the Sabbath leads to spiritual restlessness and slavery to endless striving. When the Sabbath is neglected, something deep within the human soul begins to fray. Humanity was created with a need for rhythm, a balance between work and rest, labor and worship, giving and receiving. When that balance is disrupted, restlessness takes root. In our modern world, this restlessness has become almost invisible because it has been normalized. People wear their exhaustion like a badge of honor, boasting about long hours, sleepless nights, and relentless schedules. Yet beneath the surface lies a profound spiritual emptiness. Neglecting the Sabbath is not merely about failing to take a break from physical work. It is about rejecting the divine pattern that sustains both body and soul. When God commanded his people to rest on the seventh day, he was not only protecting them from physical burnout, but inviting them into a spiritual reality where they could experience trust, peace, and joy in his provision. Without that sacred pause, life becomes a blur of activity, and people become slaves to their own ambitions, anxieties, and desires. This slavery may not have visible chains, but it is just as real as the bondage Israel experienced in Egypt. The ancient Israelites were commanded to keep the Sabbath as a sign of their freedom. They had been delivered from a land where they were forced to work without rest, where their worth was measured by their output, where their lives were consumed by the demands of a tyrannical ruler. In the same way, when modern Christians neglect the Sabbath, they fall back into a spiritual Egypt. Work becomes a pharaoh, relationships become transactional, and even acts of worship can turn into hurried obligations rather than joyful expressions of love. The human heart, left unchecked, will always drift toward endless striving because it longs to control its own destiny. The Sabbath interrupts this cycle by demanding that we stop, that we let go, that we acknowledge there is a God who sustains the universe without our constant interference. This neglect of Sabbath rest also has devastating effects on communities and families. Without a shared rhythm of rest, relationships suffer. Conversations become shallow because there is no time to truly listen. Families grow distant because they are constantly rushing from one task to another. Churches become filled with busy programs and events, but lack the deep spiritual renewal that comes from simply being in God's presence together. A culture that forgets the Sabbath becomes a culture that forgets how to truly connect, both with God and with one another. The irony is that many people neglect rest because they believe it will allow them to accomplish more, but the opposite is true. Just as the land needs to lie fallow to produce a better harvest, so too do human beings need times of rest to be fruitful. Constant motion without rest leads to diminishing returns, not only in productivity, but in creativity, joy, and spiritual vitality. On a personal level, the absence of Sabbath rest leaves individuals vulnerable to burnout, despair, and temptation. When there is no sacred space carved out for worship and reflection, the noise of the world grows louder and louder, drowning out the still, small voice of God. People turn to distractions and addictions to fill the void that only divine rest can satisfy. They chase after entertainment, material possessions, or success, hoping these things will bring peace, but they only deepen the restlessness. The Sabbath was given as a remedy for this disease of the soul. It provides a weekly opportunity to reset, to remember that life is not about endless doing, but about being loved and known by the Creator. Neglecting it is like refusing medicine for a serious illness, choosing instead to press on as if nothing is wrong. Over time, the damage accumulates until the heart grows calloused and the spirit becomes numb, unable to find joy even in moments of apparent triumph. By forgetting the Sabbath, people lose more than just a day of rest. They lose touch with the very source of life itself. Resting on the Sabbath is an act of faith and resistance, proclaiming God's sovereignty over our lives. Resting on the Sabbath is not merely a pause in activity, but a profound act of faith and resistance against the forces that seek to control and define our lives. In a world that demands constant motion and measures worth by productivity, choosing to stop is a declaration that there is a higher authority than the systems of this world. It is a way of saying that time itself belongs to God, not to our employers, our schedules, or even our ambitions. This act of resting is deeply countercultural because it challenges the very foundation of modern society, which thrives on endless consumption and busyness. When a person sets aside the Sabbath to worship, to delight in God, and to simply be rather than do, they are proclaiming with their actions that God is sovereign. They are acknowledging that the universe does not depend on their effort to keep it running, that their identity is not rooted in their achievements, and that their security comes from God's provision rather than their own striving. The Sabbath is also an act of resistance against the spiritual slavery that grips much of the world. In ancient times, when God gave the command to Israel, it was given to a people who had been freed from literal slavery. They had spent generations under Pharaoh's whip, working without rest, their value determined solely by what they could produce. The Sabbath was a radical gift, a weekly reminder that they were no longer slaves but children of the living God. Every time they rested, they were rebelling against the memory of Pharaoh, declaring that their lives were now governed by a different king. In the same way, when believers today keep the Sabbath, they are resisting